Welcome to Forbidden Desires channel that we hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I have never believed in fate, but if I did, I would say it played a cruel joke on me. The day I met Theodore, my husband Arthur had introduced us with an easy smile, oblivious to the firestorm that was bound to erupt between his son and me. Theodore was 21 at the time, all sharp angles and defiant glares, a walking embodiment of contempt. I remember thinking how different he was from KL, who carried himself with a quiet assurance, a man whose presence filled a room without demanding attention. Theodore, on the other hand, was like a flame too wild to be tamed, reckless and burning, always looking for something or someone to fight, and somehow that someone became me. I never understood it. I was nothing but civil to him when Carl and I first married, polite, even despite his clear disdain. Yet every interaction between us bristled with tension, as if we were three forces of nature destined to clash. If I asked him to pass the salt at dinner, he would slam it down so hard that grains would scatter across the table. If I walked into a room, his jaw would tighten, his body going rigid as if my mere presence was a personal offense. KL Ever, the peacemaker, would sigh and shake his head. "You two are like gasoline and fire." He would say, "Can't you just stay away from each other?" We tried. None of us even understood what it would turn into later. There were moments when I caught him staring, his dark eyes unreadable, filled with something that unsettled me, loathing perhaps, or something more dangerous, something I didn't dare name. I convinced myself that his hatred stemmed from loyalty to his mother, that he saw me as an intruder in his father's life, a woman who had stolen Carl's affections and disrupted whatever fragile balance they had before I arrived. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. Theodore didn't just hate me, he hated that he couldn't ignore me. I wasn't the kind of woman he was used to. I was older, yes, but I took care of myself, dressed with a confidence that turned heads, walked with a grace that other women my age seemed to have abandoned, and I saw the way. His eyes followed me, lingering too long on the curve of my waist, the shape of my lips, the heels I wore that made me just tall enough to meet his gaze without tilting my head. It was a silent war, the three of us circling each other like predators, unwilling to strike first until the night everything changed. Arthur was away on a business trip, something that had become more frequent over the years. I had poured myself a glass of wine, settling into the quiet luxury of our Miami home, when I heard the front door slam. Theodore, I didn't bother acknowledging him. It was easier that way, but tonight he didn't disappear into his room like he usually did. Instead, he walked into the kitchen, his movements slow, deliberate. I could feel the weight of his stare before I even turned around what I asked, keeping my tone bored, uninterested. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed over his broad C********T. His face was impassive, but his eyes, those dark, restless eyes, held something I couldn't ignore. "I was just wondering," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something sharp. "Do you enjoy this?" I frowned. "Enjoy what? This little game we play?" A slow prickle ran down my spine. "There's no game," I said evenly, taking a sip of my wine. His lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Of course not." Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my skin burning under his gaze. I should have walked away. I should have ended this conversation before it began, but I didn't, and for the first time, I wondered if Arthur had been right all along. Maybe Theodore and I weren't just fire and gasoline. Maybe we were something far more dangerous, and maybe, just maybe, neither of us wanted to stop the inevitable explosion. Once I pressed the elevator button, exhausted from the long day. It had been one of those Miami evenings where the heat clung to the skin even after sunset, making my silk blouse feel too heavy, my heels too high. The cool air inside the elevator was a relief. I exhaled, rolling my shoulders, ready to go up to the 25 road floor and leave the day behind. Just as the doors began to close, I heard a voice hold the elevator. "Theodore." I hesitated for a fraction of a second before pressing the button. The door slid open again and he stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the space. He smelled like a mixture of clean soap and something deeper, something that unsettled me. Neither of us spoke as the elevator began its ascent. It was always like this when we were alone. No fights, no sharp remarks, no exaggerated sighs of annoyance. The hostility only surfaced when Arthur was around. Like an unspoken rule between us. When Arthur was present, Theodore would make some snide remark, and I would snap back a vicious cycle that neither of us seemed willing to break. But now in the quiet hum of the elevator, the tension between us was different. It was electric. A soft jolt ran through the elevator and then suddenly we weren't moving. The dim emergency light flickered on and a mechanical groan echoed through the space. I stared at the panel, pressing the button for our floor again. "Nothing, we're stuck," I said, my voice tight. Theodore ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling great. I pulled out my phone, but of course there was no signal inside the steel box. I looked over at Theodore, expecting him to be annoyed, impatient, anything to keep up the act. We played so well, but he wasn't. He was watching me, a look in his eyes that I had never been able to read before. "Now what?" I asked, defensive because something in his gaze made me feel unsteady. He smirked, that lazy, aggravating smirk that usually made me want to roll my eyes. But this time it felt different. "Nothing," he said, leaning back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Just funny how we always seem to find ourselves alone." Scoff. "Oh yes, hilarious. Being trapped in an elevator with you is exactly how I wanted to spend my evening." His expression darkened. "That's mutual. Believe me." There was again that spark of something of provocation. It was familiar, but now I recognized it for what it really was, not hatred, not resentment, desire. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. "Why do you do that?" I asked, suddenly surprising even myself. "Why do you always have to fight me?" Theodore tilted his head slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Why do you?" His words struck me harder than they should have. I swallowed, shifting my stance. "Because you make everything impossible." He let out a low laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I make everything impossible." He pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "You walk around this apartment like you don't notice anything, like you don't see it." "See what?" I challenged, though I already knew. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides before he suddenly turned away, exhaling sharply as if trying to get control of himself. I should have let it go. I should have let the moment pass, waited for the inevitable rescue and forgotten this ever happened, but I couldn't. Was I a temptation you couldn't take? The words slipped out before I could stop them. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the small space between us. "Is that why you were fighting?" Theodore turned back to me, and before I could take a breath, his lips were on mine. It wasn't soft, it wasn't tentative. It was raw, desperate, like something that had been held back for too long, something dangerous finally being unleashed. The shock of it sent my back against the elevator wall, his body following mine. His hands gripped my waist, his fingers pressing into the fabric of my blouse, as if trying to convince himself that I was real, and I was. I was burning, melting, unraveling, under the weight of something I had refused to name for years. When he pulled away, I was breathless. His forehead rested against mine, his breathing uneven. I should have pushed him away. I should have said something, anything to stop whatever this was from going further, but I didn't. Instead, I whispered, "Theodore, you can't get away from me now." He murmured against my lips, "Until we're rescued, you belong to me." My stomach flipped. The word should have scared me, should have made me furious. But they didn't. Because I realized something terrifying. I had belonged to him long before this moment. I had belonged to him since the first time he looked at me like I was something he both hated and craved. Since the first time I saw him clench his jaw whenever Arthur touched me. Since the first time I had caught my own thoughts lingering on him longer than they should. This wasn't new. It had always been there waiting, and now that it was out in the open, there was no taking it back. Theodore kissed me again, slower, this time as if savoring it, as if letting it settle between us, marking a moment neither of us could erase. By the time the elevator jerked back to life, reality came crashing down. I pulled away, my hand still resting against his C*******T. His heartbeat was wild beneath my fingertips. We didn't speak as the doors slid open. But as I stepped out into the hallway, my legs unsteady. I heard him behind me. "Don't pretend this didn't happen," he said, his voice low. I turned, meeting his gaze. "I won't," I admitted, and that was how it began. I told myself it was a mistake, that it was the heat of the moment, the tension of being trapped together, the sharp edges of years spent pretending. We didn't feel what we felt. But the problem with pretending is that once the truth slips out, it refuses to be buried again. That night I lay beside Kale, staring at the ceiling, my body still tingling from the way Theodore had kissed me, from the way his hands had held me like he had been starving for years. I tried to focus on the steady rhythm of Arthur's breathing, on the familiarity of our life together. But all I could think about was how Theodore had looked at me when the elevator doors opened. I won't pretend this didn't happen, and neither would I. The next day at work I was distracted. I barely listened to my clients, barely heard my assistant reminding me about upcoming showings. My body was present, but my mind was elsewhere, on the memory of Theodore's lips, on the way his voice had turned rough when he said I belonged to him. Lunch. My phone buzzed. New message, Theodore. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. 4 p.m. 4:15. Oakwood Drive. Show it to me. Frowned, confused. I didn't have a scheduled showing at that address, but I recognized the property, an empty modern house on the outskirts of the city, one of the high-end listings I had been trying to sell for months. I should have ignored him. I should have deleted the message and gone about my day. But at 210:45 I was already on my way. The house was quiet when I arrived. The air inside cool from the central AC, the scent of polished wood and fresh paint filling my lungs. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the pristine marble floors. It was the kind of house people dreamed of owning, a place full of possibilities. I had barely stepped inside when I heard the door click shut. Behind me I turned, and there he was. Theodore leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching me with that same unreadable expression he always had when we were alone. "There's no client, is there?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. His lips curled slightly. "You're quick." I should have been angry. I should have told him this was reckless, that whatever had happened between us and the elevator was a mistake, but I didn't. Instead, I let him step closer. "You planned this?" I said, not moving. As he approached, he nodded. "I wanted to see if you'd come, and now that I'm here." Theodore reached out, brushing his fingertips against my wrist, and I shivered at the contact. His voice was low, teasing, but there was something dark beneath it. "Now," he murmured, "you can't run away." I should have stopped this. I should have walked out that door and never looked back. But when his hands found my waist, pulling me against him, I melted. There was no hesitation this time, no pretending. We didn't know exactly what we were doing. His mouth found mine, and I responded instantly, my fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. It was hungry, desperate, the kind of kiss that stripped away reason and left nothing but need. Theodore pressed me back until I hit the cool surface of the kitchen counter, his body flush against mine, his hands moving over me like he had been waiting for this forever. Maybe he had. Maybe I had 3. I gasped when his lips trailed down to my neck, his breath hot against my skin. "Theodore, this is dangerous," he whispered against my throat. He nodded. He lifted his head, his dark eyes searching mine, then tell me to stop. I opened my mouth. No words came. Theodore smirked. That's what I thought. The afternoon passed in a blur of heat and tangled limbs, of whispered names and stolen moments. It was reckless and selfish and completely impossible. But for the first time in years I felt alive. By the time I left the house, the sun was already beginning to set. My blouse was slightly wrinkled, my lips still swollen from his kisses, my body thrumming with the aftermath of what we had just done. I told myself it was a one-time thing. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks we became experts at secrecy. Theodore arranged fake house showings, carefully choosing properties Arthur would never ask about. He texted me at odd hours short messages that sent a thrill through me every time I read them tomorrow. 10 of the penthouse on Collins Avenue. Come to the office parking lot at lunch. I need to see you. I can't sleep. Are you thinking about me too? It was more than I should have been home. I played the perfect wife. I smiled at Arthur, asked about his day, sat beside him on the couch while he watched TV. But the guilt never came because the truth was I had never felt for Arthur what I felt for Theodore. Arthur was safety. Theodore was fire, and I was no longer afraid of burning. One afternoon, as I was leaving the agency, my phone buzzed again. 4 p.m., the beach house on Ocean Drive. Don't be late. I should have ignored it. I should have gone home. Instead, I drove straight there. Theodore was already waiting, leaning against the doorway. His shirt, unbuttoned at the top sleeves, rolled up as if he had been impatient. As soon as I stepped inside, he shut the door, pulling me against him, his mouth capturing mine in a deep, searing kiss. I laughed breathlessly when he finally pulled back. You planned this one too. His hand slid down my back, fingers pressing into my SS. I always plan. I tilted my head, running a hand down his C******T. And what if I stopped showing up? Theodore's jaw clenched. He exhaled slowly, his voice lower, now dangerous. Then I'd come find you. A shiver ran through me, but not from fear, because the truth was I wanted to be found. I wanted this. I wanted him. As we fell into each other once again, lost in the heat and secrecy of what we had become, I knew there was no turning back. We were past the point of no return. Arthur noticed, course he did. It started with small comments offhand, almost teasing. You've been in a good mood lately, he said. One evening as we sat on the balcony watching the Miami skyline glow against the night. I had my wine, he had his whiskey, and I felt Theodore's presence somewhere in the apartment behind us, like a phantom that never truly left my skin. I forced a smile, twirling my glass between my fingers. Work is going well. Arthur studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. It's more than that, you look, he hesitated, searching for the right word. You look like you're in love. The wine nearly slipped from my grip. I held my breath, forcing myself to laugh, to brush it off as nothing. But inside my heart was pounding because it was the truth, the one thing no one could say aloud. I was in love, and it wasn't with my husband. After that, I became more careful. Theodore and I never acknowledged each other at home. We didn't speak in front of Arthur, barely even made eye contact. It was a game of control, a silent agreement that only made everything burn hotter. When we were alone at night, I would lie beside Arthur, feeling the weight of his arm draped over my waist. My mind elsewhere, back in the penthouse, in the beach house, in the stolen moments where Theodore's hands were on me instead, and Theodore, he was just as tormented. He would walk past me in the hallway close enough that I could smell the faint traces of his cologne, feel the heat of his body. But he wouldn't touch me, wouldn't even look at me, and it drove me insane because I knew the second we were alone, the second we stepped out of this illusion of restraint, he would devour me. One afternoon I was at the agency finishing up paperwork when my phone vibrated. That was all it said, no location, no time, just a single word, and I knew exactly where to go. When I arrived at the house on 7th Street, Theodore was already inside, waiting in the empty living room. He had his hands in his pockets, his jaw clenched, the muscles in his forearms tense like he was barely holding something back. I shut the door behind me, locking it. We didn't speak. There was no need the moment I stepped toward him. He grabbed me, his lips crushing against mine, and I felt everything we had been holding back ignite into something uncontrollable. It was different this time. Rougher, desperate. 1.5s, his hands were everywhere, gripping, claiming, pulling me closer like he needed proof that I was real, that this was real, and it was. This was the only time either of us felt alive. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the cool wooden floor. Our breathing ragged, our bodies damp with sweat. Theodore traced a finger down my arm, his touch featherlight. How long can we do this? I turned my head, meeting his gaze. As long as we want. He exhaled his lips, curving into something bitter. No, as long as we can. The truth stung because we both knew this couldn't last forever. Arthur wasn't stupid. He was already watching me, already questioning the change in me. He didn't suspect who it was, but he knew there was someone. One day he would find out, and when that day came, everything would come crashing down. But until then, I would let the fire consume me. Because Theodore wasn't just a secret. He was a part of me. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next videos.